Some roads, when the rain falls heavily enough, seem to forget their own direction and simply ask you to trust them a little longer than usual. Iris had set out that afternoon with a simple plan, a walk along the coastal path she had followed a dozen times before, out past the old lighthouse and back along the cliffs before dinner. The sky had been overcast but calm when she left, the kind of grey that promised nothing in particular, and she had not thought twice about leaving her umbrella behind. She had come to this stretch of coast for a short break from the city, renting a small cottage of her own for the week, one with a view of the water and little else, precisely the kind of quiet she had been craving after months of long hours and longer meetings. The walk to the lighthouse had become a small daily ritual over the past few days, a way of marking the shift from the busy version of herself she left behind in the city to the slower, more patient version she was slowly rediscovering out here, one unhurried mile at a time. By the time she reached the halfway point, the wind had shifted and the clouds behind her had thickened into something far more serious, falling in dense, driving sheets that blurred the path ahead into little more than a pale grey suggestion of itself. The familiar hedgerows on either side of her blurred into soft green shapes, indistinct and unfamiliar, and the coastal path, usually so easy to follow, seemed to dissolve gradually beneath the sheer volume of water pouring down around her. Iris pulled her hood up as far as it would go, tucking her chin down against the worst of the wind, and kept walking, following what she believed to be the path, though within another 10 minutes she could no longer say with any real confidence that she still was. The world had narrowed down to a small, wet circle immediately around her, grey and streaming, every landmark she might normally have used to orient herself swallowed up in the storm. The lighthouse, which should by now have been visible somewhere ahead of her, had vanished entirely behind the thickening curtain of rain, and even the sound of the sea itself, usually so constant along this stretch of coast, had blurred into the general roar of water falling all around her, no longer distinguishable as a separate thing. She should have felt afraid, perhaps. Certainly there was a small, practical part of her mind cataloguing the situation, noting that she was cold, that her phone had little signal out here in clear days, that she did not know precisely how far she had drifted from the path. But strangely, beneath that practical awareness, something else had begun to settle instead, something closer to quiet curiosity than fear. The rain was simply too enormous, too all-encompassing to leave much room for anything but a kind of surrendered attention, and Iris found herself walking on, unhurried, watching the strange, shifting shapes the storm made of the ordinary hillside around her. She passed what might have been a low stone wall, its top barely visible above the wet grass, and followed it for a while, reasoning that walls generally led somewhere, even when paths did not. The ground beneath her boots had grown soft and uneven, squelching faintly with every step, small rivulets of rainwater carving fresh, temporary paths of their own down towards some lower point she could not see. Somewhere off to her left, she thought she heard the distant clang of a loose gate swinging in the wind, though the sound came and went so quickly within the roar of the rain that she could not be certain she had heard it at all. The wall itself seemed very old, its stones rounded and softened by generations of exactly this kind of weather, gaps here and there where a stone had slipped or been carried off entirely, patched occasionally with tangles of bramble that had grown up to fill the space instead. Iris kept one gloved hand resting lightly against its wet, mossy surface as she walked, less for balance than for the simple, steadying comfort of touching something solid and unmoving in the midst of so much shifting grey. The light was fading too, not simply from the lateness of the hour, but from the sheer density of the clouds pressing low over the whole coastline, turning the entire world a deep, muted grey, as though someone had drawn a heavy curtain across the sky and left it there. Iris kept the low wall on her right, walking steadily, telling herself in a calm, matter-of-fact tone she recognized from her own mother's voice that a coastline this well-traveled surely offered shelter somewhere close, if only she kept moving with patience rather than panic. The rain did not relent. If anything, it seemed to deepen further, drumming now with a heavy, layered roar against the hood of her jacket, a sound so constant and enveloping that it began to feel oddly less like an obstacle and more like a kind of company, filling the emptiness around her with something that was, if nothing else, alive and present and entirely absorbing. She thought, walking on through the blur of it, of how rarely she allowed herself to be quite this uncertain about anything. Her days were normally so carefully structured, so full of plans made well in advance, routes checked twice before setting out, contingencies considered and dismissed. There was something almost freeing, she realized, in this rare, forced surrender to not knowing exactly where she was or how long it might take to find her way again. The storm had taken that particular burden of planning entirely out of her hands, leaving her nothing to do but keep walking and pay close attention to whatever small clue the landscape offered next. It occurred to her, somewhere in the middle of that long, wet, unhurried stretch of walking, that she could not actually remember the last time she had allowed a single afternoon to unfold so entirely outside her own control. Even her holidays, she realized, tended to arrive pre-scheduled down to the hour, restaurant reservations made weeks ahead, museum tickets booked before she had even packed her bags. This storm, in its own rough and dripping way, had handed her something she had not realized she still wanted: an afternoon with absolutely no plan left to follow, only the immediate physical task of placing one foot carefully in front of the other and trusting that the land, sooner or later, would offer up an answer of its own. A cluster of dark shapes appeared ahead of her eventually, low and hunched against the storm, and as she drew closer, she realized they were sheep, huddled together beneath the meager shelter of a wind-bent hawthorn tree, their wool darkened and flattened by the rain. They watched her pass with mild, unbothered interest, entirely unfazed by the storm that had so thoroughly disoriented her, and Iris found herself smiling despite the cold water now trickling steadily down the back of her neck. If the sheep were not worried, she decided, there was perhaps no urgent reason for her to be either. One of them, a young ewe with a dark patch over one eye, lifted her head and watched Iris pass with what looked almost like polite curiosity, chewing slowly and without any apparent concern for the weather raging around her. Iris found herself talking to them, quietly, more for her own comfort than any expectation of a response, telling them in a low, steady voice, barely audible over the rain, that she was simply looking for the way down, and did any of them happen to know it. The sheep, unsurprisingly, offered no reply beyond a slow blink and a returned interest in the wet grass at their hooves. But Iris felt lighter for having spoken aloud all the same, the small, absurd comfort of company, however unresponsive, in the middle of so much gray and empty weather.
Beyond the sheep, the wall she had been following curved gently to the right, following the natural fall of the land downward, and Iris followed it without hesitation now, reasoning that downhill, at least, would eventually lead her toward the small cluster of villages she knew lined this stretch of coast, if she could not yet say which one she might arrive at first. The ground grew rockier as she descended, the grass giving way gradually to loose shale and low, wind-stunted gorse bushes, their yellow flowers barely visible now in the fading gray light, closed tight against the rain. She picked her way carefully between them, her boots slipping occasionally on the wet stone, though she never once lost her footing entirely, some old, sure-footed instinct guiding her downward almost without conscious thought. Every so often, a particularly strong gust would drive the rain nearly sideways for a moment, stinging briefly against the one strip of exposed skin at her jaw, before the wind settled again into its steadier, more predictable pattern. She began to notice small variations in the storm's rhythm the longer she walked within it, moments of slightly softer rain followed by fresh, heavier bursts, as though the whole system breathed in long, irregular cycles she was only now, out of necessity, learning to read. The rain's roar shifted subtly as she descended further, taking on a slightly different quality, and after a moment, Iris realized she could hear beneath the endless patter of rain against gorse and stone the low, steady murmur of the sea somewhere below and ahead of her, closer now than she had expected. She paused for a moment, getting her bearings as best she could by sound alone, and then continued on, following the murmur as much as the wall, trusting that the coastline itself, if nothing else, would eventually lead her somewhere familiar.
It was the smell that reached her before the light did, faint and warm and entirely unexpected in the midst of so much cold, driving rain, the unmistakable scent of wood smoke drifting toward her on the wind. She stopped completely, lifting her face slightly to catch it more clearly, and there, a short distance ahead and slightly below her, she saw it, a small, low cottage tucked into a fold of the hillside, its single downstairs window glowing a soft, buttery gold against the gray storm surrounding it. Relief moved through her, quiet and warm, though it was not quite the relief of rescue so much as the relief of arrival, the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of finding exactly the kind of small, glowing shelter that every long, uncertain walk secretly hopes to end in. She made her way carefully down the last stretch of wet, uneven ground toward it, her legs tired now in the pleasant, honest way that came from real exertion, her clothes soaked through completely, and yet her spirits, oddly, higher than they had been in weeks. The cottage was smaller even than it had first appeared, a single-story stone building with a low slate roof, its walls thick and weathered by decades, perhaps centuries of exactly this kind of coastal weather. A narrow chimney sent up a steady thread of pale smoke that the wind caught and dispersed almost as quickly as it appeared, and a small wooden gate, hanging slightly loose on its hinges, marked the boundary of what might once have been a proper garden, now mostly overgrown with wet, wind-flattened grass. A rusted weather vane shaped like a small sailing ship spun uncertainly atop the chimney, unable to settle on any single direction in the shifting, gusting wind. Iris pushed the gate open carefully, its hinges groaning softly beneath the sound of the rain, and made her way up the short stone path to the front door, beneath a narrow overhang that offered the first real shelter she had found in over an hour. A pair of well-worn Wellington boots stood neatly beside the doorstep, and a small brass knocker shaped like a leaping fish gleamed faintly despite the gloom.
She knocked twice, firmly but not urgently, and waited, water still streaming steadily off the edge of her hood, pooling briefly on the worn stone step beneath her before running off toward the grass. The door opened a few moments later, revealing a woman, perhaps in her 60s, her white hair pinned back loosely, wearing a heavy cardigan the color of moss, and holding a small oil lamp that cast a warm, flickering light across her weathered, kind face. She looked Iris over once, quickly and without alarm, the practiced, assessing glance of someone who had opened this door to plenty of storm-soaked strangers before. "Goodness," the woman said, taking in Iris's soaked state with immediate, practical concern rather than alarm. "You had quite a walk of it. Come in before you catch your death standing there." Iris stepped gratefully to cross the threshold, and warmth wrapped around her immediately, thick and rich after so long in the cold, driving rain, carrying the mingled scents of wood smoke, drying wool, and something savory simmering slowly somewhere out of sight. The cottage's single main room was small, but deeply, thoroughly lived in, its low ceiling crossed by dark wooden beams, its walls lined with shelves crowded with books, old photographs, and the small accumulated treasures of a long life spent in one place. A worn braided rug covered most of the stone floor near the hearth, its colors softened by years of foot traffic, and a small dresser against the far wall held a mismatched collection of china, cups and saucers gathered, Iris suspected, over decades rather than bought all at once. A ship's barometer hung on one wall, its brass casing tarnished with age, its needle currently pointed firmly toward a section of the dial that even without reading the fine print, Iris guessed did not say fair weather. Dried bundles of herbs and lavender hung from one of the low beams near the kitchen area, their faint, sweet scent mingling pleasantly with the smoke and the simmering pot. "I got turned around on the coastal path. I'm so sorry, I don't mean to track water through your home." "Water dries," the woman said simply, waving the concern away with one weathered hand. "People catching cold does not, so let's see about getting you warm first and worry about the floor later." She set the lamp down on a low table and moved with brisk, unhurried efficiency towards a small fireplace crackling steadily in the corner, adding another log with practiced ease. "Sit yourself down there, by the fire. I'll fetch a towel and something dry." Iris lowered herself gratefully into a worn armchair positioned close to the hearth, its cushions soft and slightly sunken from years of exactly this kind of use, and let the fire's warmth begin, slowly, to work its way back into her chilled hands and feet. She could hear the woman moving through what must have been a small back room, the soft creak of a wardrobe door, quiet, unhurried steps against old wooden floorboards.
The woman returned a few minutes later with a thick towel, a woolen blanket, and a set of dry clothes that looked, Iris suspected, as though they might have belonged to a daughter or granddaughter who no longer lived quite so close to this particular stretch of coast. "There's a small room through there where you can change," the woman said, nodding toward a narrow door beside the fireplace. "Take your time. The kettle will be on by the time you're finished." Iris thanked her and made her way through to the small back room, changing quickly out of her soaked clothes and into the dry ones offered, which fit reasonably well despite being not quite her own size, the sleeves a little long, the collar slightly loose. She wrapped the towel briefly around her damp hair before emerging back into the main room, where the woman had indeed set a kettle to boil over the fire, its low, rising hiss blending pleasantly with the steady patter of rain against the small windows. Sit, the woman said again, gesturing toward the armchair. "You look like you could use it."
Iris sank back into the chair gratefully, pulling the offered blanket up over her knees, and watched the fire for a while in comfortable, unhurried silence as the woman moved about her small kitchen, taking down 2 mismatched mugs from a shelf crowded with mismatched things, spooning tea leaves into a chipped ceramic pot. "I'm Iris," she said, remembering her manners. "Margaret," the woman replied, not looking up from her task, "though most people out this way just call me Meg." She glanced toward the window, where the rain continued its heavy, insistent drumming against the glass. "You picked quite a storm to get lost in." "I really didn't mean to get lost at all," Iris admitted, smiling faintly. "The path just seemed to disappear somewhere along the way." "It does that in weather like this," Meg said, unbothered, pouring the now boiling water carefully over the tea leaves. "I've lived out here 40 years, and I still lose that path myself sometimes when the rain comes in fast enough off the water. No shame in it at all. The land doesn't care how well you know it, not when the sky decides to make its own rules for an afternoon." She carried the teapot and 2 mugs over to the low table beside Iris's chair, settling herself into the second armchair across from it with the easy, unhurried motions of someone entirely at home in her own small kingdom. She poured the tea slowly, its dark amber stream catching the firelight, and handed 1 mug to Iris before wrapping both hands around her own. "There was a storm, must be 20 years back now," Meg went on, settling more comfortably into her chair, "when a young fellow from one of the walking groups ended up at this very door, soaked clean through just as you were, having wandered nearly 2 miles past where he meant to turn back. We sat by that same fire half the night, waiting for the wind to drop enough for him to ring his group and let them know he'd not been swept out to sea after all. Turned out he'd only gone and taken a photograph of every gorse bush along the way, trying to keep track of where he'd been. Never did work, of course. They all look the same in weather like that, but I did enjoy the pictures he sent me afterward, once he'd got home and dried out properly." "Thank you," Iris said, accepting the warm mug gratefully, feeling its warmth settle deep into her still cold fingers, and looked around the small room properly for the first time since arriving. A collection of small weathered shells lined one windowsill, arranged with obvious care by size and color, pale pinks graduating slowly into deeper creams and browns. A faded photograph in a simple wooden frame showed a much younger Meg standing beside a tall, smiling man on a sunlit beach, both of them squinting slightly against the light, his arm resting easily around her shoulders. A well-worn armchair identical to the one Iris now sat in occupied the room's other corner, its cushions bearing the soft indentation of decades of quiet evenings, undoubtedly his once, Iris guessed, though she did not ask. "Is it just you out here?" Iris asked, gently, unsure if the question crossed some line she shouldn't cross with a stranger.
"Just me most of the year," Meg said, unbothered by the question. "My husband passed some years back now. My daughter visits when she can, though she lives further inland these days, closer to the city. I manage well enough. The cottage keeps me busy, and the coast keeps me company, storms and all." She smiled, a warm, easy expression that suggested this was simply a settled fact of her life, rather than any lingering source of sorrow. "Besides, every so often, the rain brings me a visitor, and that's company enough for one evening." Outside, the storm showed no immediate signs of softening, the rain continuing its steady, heavy drumming against the small windows, the wind occasionally gusting hard enough to rattle the old frames gently in their sockets. The fire crackled steadily in its hearth, throwing warm, shifting light across the low wooden beams overhead, and Iris felt her earlier disorientation settling slowly into something closer to simple, grateful stillness, the last of the day's cold uncertainty dissolving quietly beneath the fire's steady, patient warmth. "You're welcome to stay the night if the rain doesn't let up," Meg offered, as though reading the shape of Iris's thoughts. "I've a spare room, small but dry, and there's no sense walking back out into that until morning, if morning brings clearer skies. The path will still be there tomorrow, it generally is." She said it lightly, without any pressure behind it, the offer resting easily in the warm air between them, entirely free of the small obligation such offers sometimes carried. Iris hesitated only briefly before accepting, some old habit of independence rising up automatically and then just as quickly releasing its grip. There was something in Meg's easy, unhurried hospitality that made the offer feel entirely natural to accept, free of any awkward debt or obligation, simply one traveler's shelter freely offered to another who had for one stormy evening lost her way and found instead exactly what she hadn't known she needed. "Thank you," Iris said again, meaning it fully this time. "I'd like that very much." "Good," Meg said, satisfied, rising to add another log to the fire. "Then there's no more to decide tonight, just tea and the fire and whatever this storm still has left to say for itself." They sat together for a long while after that, the conversation drifting easily between comfortable silences, small stories exchanged without any particular urgency. Meg's stories of decades spent along this same stretch of coast, of storms far worse than this one, of the small particular joys of a life built slowly around tides and seasons rather than schedules and plans. Iris found herself listening more than speaking, content simply to absorb the easy rhythm of another person's well-settled life, so different from her own, and yet in this warm, fire-lit room, entirely welcoming. Eventually, Meg rose to check on the pot simmering quietly on the stove, a simple, hearty soup that filled the small cottage with a rich, savory warmth entirely its own, thick with potatoes and leeks and some dark, herby seasoning Iris couldn't quite place, though she suspected it came from the same dried bundles hanging near the kitchen beam. She ladled out 2 bowls, and they ate together at the small kitchen table, the rain still falling steadily beyond the windows, the fire still crackling low and warm behind them, the whole small cottage wrapped snugly in its own private pocket of warmth against the vast, dark, storm-soaked coastline surrounding it. "This is wonderful," Iris said, meaning it fully, savoring a spoonful of the thick, warming broth. "Is it a family recipe?" "Of a sort," she smiled faintly over her own bowl. "My husband's mother taught it to me back when I first moved out this way and had the first idea how to cook for a fisherman's appetite. I've changed it a little over the years, added a bit more of this, left out a bit of that, until it became properly mine rather than hers. That's how most good recipes end up, I find, and most good lives too, if you let them." Iris smiled at that, turning the small piece of wisdom quietly over her mind as she finished her soup, the warmth of the meal settling comfortably alongside the warmth of the fire, both of them working slowly together to smooth away the last of the day's cold, uncertain edges.
After the meal, Meg showed Iris to the small spare room at the back of the cottage, not more than a narrow bed, a simple wooden chest, and a single small window overlooking what, in daylight, would likely be a modest kitchen garden, now entirely lost to the darkness and rain outside. A thick quilt, hand-stitched and slightly faded with age, lay folded neatly at the foot of the bed, and a small oil lamp sat on the chest, with its wick already trimmed and ready. A framed watercolor of the coastline hung above the bed, its colors softened by sunlight over many years, depicting, Iris realized, with a small smile, almost exactly the view she must have been unable to see from the storm-blurred path that afternoon, the lighthouse standing clear and white against a calm blue sky, utterly unlike the one she had actually walked through.
"Sleep well," Meg said, setting a second, larger blanket over the chest in case the night grew colder. "The rain tends to sing you right to sleep out here once you stop fighting it and just let it. There's no arguing with a storm like this. Best just let it do its work while you do yours, which tonight is only resting." She paused at the doorway a moment, the small oil lamp in her hand casting a warm, wavering light across the low wooden threshold. "There's porridge in the morning whenever you wake, no rush. The path will look a good deal friendlier once the sun's back over the water." She left Iris alone with a quiet, easy warmth still lingering in the room, the sound of her footsteps fading softly back toward the main room, where the fire would burn on a while longer before she banked it for the night. Iris changed into the simple night clothes Meg had left for her, climbed into the narrow bed, and pulled the quilt up over her shoulders, feeling for the first time all evening the full, honest weight of her tiredness finally settling over her. The rain continued steadily beyond the small window, its rhythm unchanged from the storm that had disoriented her so thoroughly out on the coastal path, and yet it sounded entirely different now, heard from inside this small, warm room, wrapped in dry blankets, her stomach full of Meg's simple, generous soup. What had felt only hours earlier like an enormous, disorienting force capable of swallowing every familiar landmark whole, now sounded instead like exactly what Meg had called it, a kind of lullaby, patient and enveloping, asking nothing more of her now than to simply rest. Iris lay quietly for a while, listening to the storm's steady rhythm mix with the fainter, more distant sound of the sea somewhere beyond the cottage, the two overlapping into one long, continuous hush that filled the whole dark room evenly, comfortingly, without a single sharp edge anywhere within it. She thought, drifting slowly toward sleep, about how strange it was that losing her way so completely that afternoon had led her, by the end of the very same evening, somewhere she could not possibly have found by following any planned or familiar route. She thought of Meg, alone most of the year in her small stone cottage, and yet clearly deeply at peace with the shape her life had taken, storms and solitude and all. She thought of the sheep, unbothered beneath their hawthorn tree, entirely unfazed by the very storm that had so thoroughly disoriented her own careful sense of direction. She thought too of her own carefully planned days waiting for her back in the city, and wondered, half asleep already, whether she might carry just a little of this evening's easy, unplanned surrender back with her when she returned, some small permission to occasionally let a storm redirect her rather than always insisting on the path she had originally set out to follow. She thought too of the young man from Meg's story, 20 years gone now from this same small room, photographing gorse bushes in a hopeless attempt to hold on to his bearings, and found herself smiling faintly in the dark at the thought of it, at how many other travelers must have passed through this same narrow bed over the years, each one arriving by their own accidental route, each one leaving again eventually with some small, useful piece of the coast's patience folded quietly into their luggage alongside their dried clothes. The rain outside showed no sign of stopping, falling steadily over the whole dark coastline, over the small huddled sheep still sheltering somewhere beneath their hawthorn tree, over the low stone wall Iris had followed downhill, over the coastal path she would find again easily enough in the clear light of morning, and over the small cottage itself, its single downstairs light finally extinguished now, as Meg too made her way toward her own quiet rest. Iris's breathing slowed, matching the storm's steady, unhurried rhythm, her body loose and warm beneath the thick, hand-stitched quilt, her mind settling gently into the same deep, contented stillness that seemed to fill every corner of Meg's small, weathered cottage. Somewhere between one soft breath and the next, between the rain's steady patter and the sea's low, distant murmur, she slipped quietly into sleep, entirely and gratefully found in the very last place she had ever expected to end up that evening, and glad in some small, wordless way that the storm had chosen exactly this door to lead her toward.